Good morning. So I have a story about two gardens, a larger one and a smaller one contained within it, and about beauty and diversity in the home garden. In their book, The Living Landscape, Rick Dark and Doug Tallamy argue that this relationship between beauty and diversity has created ethical issues never before faced by gardeners. They go on to say, because the resources and services that support all humans come from functional landscapes, and function starts with plants, the planting and management choices we make at home impact our neighbors and indeed our greater society as a whole. So I moved to rural Iowa in 1971, having grown up in the dry, shortgrass prairie of Western Kansas, and later lived in Los Angeles and Kansas City. Albert and I have about 4.5 acres, our little garden, surrounded by commercial corn and beans. Land that when Albert bought it had been under the plow only once since being surveyed first in 1852. Throughout our lives, we have been dedicated vegetable gardeners and shared a delight in learning how this little piece of extraordinarily fertile land could turn into food. We made a lot of mistakes and learned a lot from our 70-foot long rows of early golden bantam and our 45 tomato plants every year. But there's another gardening story that we learned over time. So I first saw Iowa in high summer, and my impressions of Iowa then was of an idyllic formal garden. There were more farms and smaller farms then with greater diversity of crops. And there was great beauty in the patchwork fields, the rows of contrasting greens and yellows, the contours of the waterways running through it all. Now, this was clearly a naive impression even then, but it was reinforced by the incredible variety of wild plants and animals that flourished in our 4.5 acres. There were elderberry bushes, wild black cherry, black raspberry, and grapevines. Quail came out of our thickets and called to each other in the spring. There were mink in a little stream about 1/4 mile from our house. In the 50 years that Albert and I were cultivating our garden, however, I gradually came to notice that the surrounding landscape was changing. First, I looked around for the birds. In the past 50 years, according to the Iowa DNR, North America lost 1 in 4 birds, but grassland birds declined by 53%, and eastern meadowlarks by 75%. I have not seen a meadowlark around my house in many years, or a dickcissel, or a horned lark, also grassland birds. Then the remnant bits of untilled land were going away. Abandoned farmsteads were plowed up, and we saw fewer and fewer of the birds that like tree cover. So we have not seen orchard orioles or little screech owls for a long time. The guaranteed market for corn created by renewable fuel standards put a lot of land previously considered marginal into corn production. So loss of habitat and Roundup-ready crops reduced the insect numbers, so that monarch butterfly populations declined more than 90% over 20 years. 52% of native bees are now in decline in North America. And looking around at the plant life on the 4.5 acres, a lot of those original natives have been replaced by invasives, such as exotic bush honeysuckle. Where can we turn in Iowa to reestablish that connection between beauty and biodiversity? Can we look to Iowa public lands? Iowa and Nebraska are tied for third from the lowest in the percentage of state area and public lands, just 2.8%. We have already too many ethical dilemmas, and we need beauty and color in our lives. Let me close with Talamy and Dark again, just as a reminder. Because the resources and services that support all human life come from functional landscapes, and function starts with plants, the planting and management choices we make at home impact our neighbors and indeed our greater society as a whole. In essence, they say, the relationship between plants and ecosystem function makes the ecological functionality of our landscapes a public resource, just like a reservoir, a river, and a national park. And so to continue with this, Elaine Hughes will be our next speaker.
Thanks, Sally. Like Sally and Albert, my love of nature also had rural roots. I grew up on a farm in western Iowa, which bordered the Missouri River, 16 miles south of Sioux City. This was late in the late 1940s, 1950s, and early 60s. As any of you know who lived on a farm during that era, the farms were far different from the farms of today, as Sally has alluded to. On our farm, there were fence rows with some trees, shrubs, and weeds where bluebirds built their nests. We had a slough where you would find turtles and frogs. There was a pasture, an alfalfa field, a bank with huge cottonwood trees, and some very low land close to the river filled with willow trees. The ditches were not mowed. There was a row of plum trees covered by a variety of butterflies in late summer, early fall, feasting on overripe plums. We had a few pigs who wallowed in the mud, a few milk cows in the pasture, free-range chickens, and a horse and wild kittens in the haymow. And we had weeds, lots of weeds that I now call native pollinator plants. Now, my father would turn over in his grave if he knew I was planting thistle and milkweed and some of those things we worked so hard to cut out of the beans. But the thistle was covered with goldfinches and butterflies. I spent my childhood summers outside exploring all the areas on the farm because at that time there just wasn't much to do. And our parents did not take us into town for scheduled activities. We did grow corn and soybeans, but it seemed that they were just part of a natural habitat. My motivation to plant native pollinators began with the Save the Monarch butterfly campaign about 10 years ago. I planted a small patch of 3 varieties of milkweed mixed with a few other plants. We lived on the bank of the Watsapinican River at the time where there were wooded and brushy areas nearby, so we did see a lot of birds and other wildlife. Then, about 7 years ago, we bought a house in a newer subdivision in Independence. There was nothing planted in the backyard as you can see from this first slide. There was nothing in the backyards of the house directly in back of us or on one side of us, not a sign of life. For a whole winter, I stared out the patio door at nothing but snow. But in my mind, I began imagining a space that would attract not only monarchs, but birds, bees, and butterflies, and other insects. My vision began with planting a green fence around the perimeter of the backyard, which would contain a variety of native shrubs with berries for the birds and 3 trees. The shrubs and trees would be interspersed with native pollinator plants. Pollinator plants would also be planted around the deck. Now, in this 6th summer since beginning our project, as you can see from the second slide, there has been a lot of change. It's amazing how quickly things can grow. When I look out our patio door, I see Sally's orchard orioles and Baltimore orioles. I see robins feeding worms to their young, hummingbirds, a pair of catbirds, a pair of cardinals, finches, and also kingbirds. I see a variety of butterflies, bees, wasps, and dragonflies. I also see an occasional rabbit eating the clover and deer nibbling on the shrubs in the winter. At first, I would get really upset when I realized the birds were eating the butterflies, bees, and wasps. I didn't know they ate all those things. Then I would get upset when I would see a Cooper's hawk fly into the yard and grab a bird. Now I can find consolation in the fact that it is all a part of that interdependent web of life, of existence, of which we are a part. I find contentment, peace, and joy in an environment that is full of green and flowering vegetation, an environment that is alive with all manner of insect and animal life. It's almost meditative. However, I find that I can get some consolation from Iowa's drastically changed landscape, which makes me very angry when I realize that I, as an individual, cannot change the whole state or turn back the clock. But I can do my little part by creating a native habitat in our own small space, in our own backyard. For a little while, I can forget about political turmoil, all the injustice in this world, and climate change. Although I shouldn't have really put climate change because it's really hard this summer to forget about climate change. So in closing, I would like to show you a few photographs of the wildlife that I now see when I look out my patio door. And Steve is going to run through the monarch butterfly on swamp milkweed. A kingbird eating berries in the viburnum. A hummingbird at a cardinal plant. A wasp on swamp milkweed. A pair of Baltimore orioles. I had an orchard oriole photo and I should have brought it. I didn't realize Sally was going to talk about them. a goldfinch, and some flowers. Yes, the state bird of Iowa. A spiced bush swallowtail, which are very rare to see. A rabbit in the clover, which we have a lot of because we don't use chemicals. Tiger swallowtail on a coneflower. And that's why I garden.
Elaine said that I caught her at a weak moment when she said yes to doing this because public speaking is really not her thing, but I really appreciate you for going out of your comfort zone. And I also learned that Elaine is a wonderful photographer, which I didn't know. I didn't know if there was going to be time for me to put in my 2 cents. I was the wild card here, but fortunately we do have time. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my gardening. I did not grow up on a farm. I grew up in upstate New York in an area where a lot of what had once been farmland had been allowed to revert to woods as kind of more intensive farming moved to the Midwest as the Midwest was settled. But I did have lots of opportunities for foraging. There was a vacant lot next door to our house that was full of wild strawberries, and I would spend hours. Wild strawberries are like teeny and they're really sweet, and I would spend hours and hours picking them. There were wild raspberries up on the mountain. There were even wild blueberries. But I didn't do any gardening until after I moved to Iowa and bought my first house. And my main motivation of growing things was to eat them. My husband is the one who plants flowers. I plant vegetables and fruits. I am a very messy gardener. I tend to let the weeds grow rather tall and then pull them up and lay them down as mulch. I also have way too much sympathy for volunteer plants, which can make weeding difficult. If there's a tomato coming up in the middle of the green beans, is that a weed? I have a very hard time considering a tomato to be a weed, but sometimes it needs to be. Another one of my gardening principles is to avoid buying things as much as possible. I used to say I would never pay for dirt or mulch or fertilizer, because if you know who to ask and are, willing to spend some elbow grease, you can generally get them for free. People who have horses and chickens and so forth are delighted to let you clean out where they live and get some fertilizer for your garden. An old-fashioned bed frame with metal strings makes a great pea fence. My tomato frames right now are some sort of restaurant style chairs with a wooden frame, and until you take out the seat and you take out the back and you tie a little string between them, and that's my tomato frames. I haven't been in the last few years gardening as much as I used to. Neither has my husband, but there was a period when you heard about locavore eating, I used to say I was a hyper locavore because I ate out of the backyard. And when we had chickens, that was even more true. It was a great feeling to look at your plate and realize everything on it was out of the backyard, except maybe the salt and the pepper. So that's my take on gardening. But pulling back a little bit, I wanted to talk just a little bit about gardening as a spiritual discipline. Obviously, what Sally and Elaine were talking about has a lot to do with the 7th principle, the interdependent web of all existence, and respecting our place in it and trying to keep the planet going. Gardening is also a form of meditation. I have a friend who talks about weeding meditation. It's a way of slowing down and focusing on the here and now. It's a way of developing your own creativity. Every gardener has their own unique styles of doing things and methods, and it tends to be cyclical. You do the same things at the same time of year each year. So to quote the poet May Sarton, everything that slows us down and forces patience, everything that sets us back into the slow circles of nature is a help. Gardening is an instrument of grace.